So we're going to start our 7th unit today, and this unit is going to focus on the Byzantine Empire and also Russia. The Byzantine Empire was a continuation of the Roman Empire, and in fact the people living in the Byzantine Empire would have considered themselves to be Romans. Now this isn't going on all by itself. In Arabia, we also have the rise of a new religion, Islam, and we'll cover that religion next unit, but know that as the Byzantine Empire is going on, we also have Islam spreading throughout the Middle East and North Africa. And at the same time, Western Europe is trying to rebuild after the fall of the Roman Empire. And we'll cover them in a couple of units. And we'll see the rise of Charlemagne trying to create a new Rome as well. So we see the rise of 3 empires during the same time period. It's all happening at once. The Byzantine Empire had its roots in the Roman Empire. Emperor Diocletian had divided the empire into 2 parts, a west and an east. He thought that these smaller portions would make it easier to rule, and each side had its own emperor. Emperor Constantine was known for a few things. One was making Christianity legal within the Roman Empire, but also moving the capital of the Roman Empire to the city of Byzantium. He did that in 330 CE. From there, Byzantium was renamed Constantinople. It was named after this emperor. We would go on to see the Western Roman Empire fall in 476 CE, but the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital Constantinople, would survive. And it's going to last for another 1,000 years. And we call it the Byzantine Empire, after the name of the original city, Byzantium. So Emperor Constantine can be seen as a founder of sorts to this Byzantine Empire, as it was under his rule that he moved the capital from Rome to Byzantium, which would go on to be renamed Constantinople. So this is a map of the Byzantine Empire at its peak. We've got the capital at Constantinople, and that was on the Bosporus Strait. It was a very strong position for trade and defense. If we look at this empire, they controlled almost the entirety of the Mediterranean Sea, but they had lost many of the territories that the Romans once governed, including Spain, including Gaul, which is today France, and Britain. Constantinople was in a very strong position. It was on the eastern frontier of the empire, so it was protected from Germanic barbarians, unlike the Western Empire. And that's where those barbarians, like the Visigoths and Vandals, were moving into. They were moving into Western Europe. The city of Constantinople was on a peninsula, and it had natural harbors. So it was easy to defend. They only had to build 2 large walls to protect the one land entrance, and they were able to trade due to these harbors. Constantinople was a crossroads of trade. If you wanted to move goods by sea, you had to go through the Bosporus Strait. So from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, you've got to cross Constantinople. And if you wanted to move by land from Asia into Europe, well, Constantinople was a great place for you to move through. The Byzantine Empire would go on to preserve Greco-Roman culture, the ideas of both the Romans and the Greeks, until it was conquered by the Ottoman Empire. And this makes sense. The Byzantine Empire was based in Greece, and they spoke the Greek language. But they also considered themselves to be Romans and took aspects of Roman culture as well. So for them, they were the best of both worlds. Here we have a city map of Constantinople. It is a peninsula. We have water on 3 sides. And that means we only have one entrance that invaders can get through by land. And they end up building several walls protecting that one land entrance. We also have natural harbors here, 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 and here. So that means that boats could dock and bring in supplies. So trade was very strong in Constantinople. Here we have the walls of Constantinople. And we can tell that these walls were not built all at one time. We can see the original walls down this way. We can tell because the bricks are not quite as uniform as the newer bricks and crenellations that have been added later on. And this is the area where you can shoot your arrows out of. And you're still protected to some extent. As we said earlier, the Byzantines preserved Greco-Roman culture. Their education was based around Greek and Roman knowledge, which had been stored in Byzantine libraries. The Byzantines spoke the Greek language. They studied the classics from both Greece and Rome. They studied Homer's epic poems, along with that of Virgil, who was a Roman writer. They followed Euclid for geometry, Herodotus in history, and Galen, who was a Roman in medicine. The greatest of the Byzantine emperors was Justinian, and he ruled for almost 40 years. And his time as emperor was called the Golden Age of the Byzantine Empire. He had several accomplishments. One of his greatest was the codification of Roman law. It was known as Justinian's Code. Anytime we codify or make something a code, it means we're writing it down. And since we wrote those laws down, they're going to influence future European laws. This Justinian's Code contained 5,000 Roman laws still considered useful. But then new laws passed after 534 CE. Also in this law book were opinions from Roman thinkers and philosophers, political and legal philosophers, and a textbook to interpret the laws. So this was a pretty big book, but it was all written down and people knew the rules. Justinian would reconquer former Roman territories. His greatest general was Belisarius, and he sent out Belisarius and his army to attack the Germanic tribes people who had taken over the Western Roman Empire. And he did have quite a bit of success there, but it was not lasting for the Byzantine Empire. Soon enough, those Germanic kingdoms rose up again. He expanded trade, which brought wealth and power to the empire, and of course, more cultural diffusion. This mosaic shows off how powerful Justinian was. Justinian is here front and center. The first thing you should notice is he's wearing a maroon purple robe. Of course, that color came from the Phoenicians, those snails. Also notice he's wearing a crown showing his political power. And he has a halo around his head showing religious power. Now at this point in history, artists weren't as good at making artwork. So instead of the ring that sits on top of his head, it almost looks like a globe around his head. To the right, we have his priests and his scholars. And to the left, we have his generals, like Belisarius here, and the soldiers. So it shows that Justinian has political power, military power, and religious power over his people. So the Byzantine Empire would trade for amber, which came from the Baltic region. So we've got the Byzantine Empire, its capital Constantinople down here near the Black Sea. And they would use these rivers to move north to where we have the modern day countries of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And they would trade for amber. Amber is made of tree sap, really. And they would use it to create decorations, ornaments, and jewelry. And that used to be an SOL question. I don't think we're going to have to worry about the SOL this year. But we do need to know that the people of the Byzantine Empire and the people of the Baltic region would trade with each other, and they would use these rivers to travel upon. More on that when we get to Russia soon enough. Artists in the Byzantine Empire create art for two reasons. One, for religion, and they were Christians, and two, to show off the power of the emperor. And these mosaics would be placed in public and religious structures for all the people to see. If you're the emperor, you want people to know how powerful you are, just like we saw in the image of Justinian. In the Byzantine Empire, they would create icons, which are religious images. We'll learn more about those later today. Scholars and monks would create illuminated manuscripts. These were handwritten and illustrated, and they were created to preserve classic knowledge of Greece and Rome. So when we illuminate something, we make it brighter. And a manuscript is a written document. So we draw pictures to illuminate them, to brighten up the pages, and to help the reader understand what was going on. We will also see Emperor Justinian beautify Constantinople. He builds churches, palaces, courthouses, schools, baths, and of course, new fortresses. He wants people to come to check out Constantinople, knowing that this brings in more trade. And of course, if you're in Constantinople, you would tax people for trading there, and it enriches your city and your empire. Here's an example of an illuminated manuscript. We've got the writing down here, but we've got a picture to tell the story of what's going on. And notice that they don't waste any space on this paper. Paper back then is not like today where it's readily accessible. So you want to make sure that each page is fully covered. They would include these illuminations or illustrations in the text. So when they start a new paragraph, that first capitalized letter, they would stick a picture there. This page shows plants and what they might be used for. So again, trying to catalog knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans and preserve it in their libraries. So we said that Justinian beautified Constantinople, his capital. And one of the things that he was known for building would be churches. And the most famous church is the Hagia Sophia, which means Church of Holy Wisdom. It was considered the crowning glory of Justinian's reign. And this is what we think it would have looked like during the time of the Byzantine Empire. Now, it was converted into a mosque when the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople. And today it's actually a museum. This is what the Hagia Sophia looks like today. These spires were added during the reign of the Ottomans over Constantinople. These spires are known as minarets. We'll talk about them in our next unit. Here is another depiction of the Hagia Sophia when it was under Byzantine control. We can tell it was a church because we can see the cross at the top. But notice that they used domes, which again came from the Roman Empire. We see several of these domes. We see arches. So we see a lot of the features that were created by the Romans. We can see the Hagia Sophia in the background here. And during the time of the Ottoman conquest, they built the Blue Mosque here as well. Here is what the inside of the Hagia Sophia looks like today. All of the Christian imagery has been removed, and it's been replaced with calligraphy, which comes from the Islamic world, and we'll talk about that next unit. Justinian had a wife named Theodora, and she would have an impact on his reign of the Byzantine Empire. She was a former actress, and back then actress meant something different, maybe more in line with an exotic dancer or prostitute. Nonetheless, she rose up after humble beginnings and would eventually share power with Emperor Justinian as the Empress. And she would inspire Justinian's legal and spiritual reforms, and she also promoted women's rights. One of those being that women have the right to divorce their husband, and that women couldn't be forced into prostitution. So these ideas probably came from her early life and how she was treated, and she wanted to make sure that women didn't suffer the same things that she went through. In this depiction of Theodora, we can see some similarities between her and her husband Justinian and his mosaic. Notice that she is also wearing a crown, showing political power. She has a halo. She's also wearing a maroon, purplish looking cape. She's holding an icon of Jesus, and her cloak, her dress, actually makes a cross. So again, it shows that she has political power and religious power. Like the Romans, the Byzantines wanted entertainment as well, and they would find their entertainment at the hippodrome, where they would watch chariot races. And like today, we have our favorite teams. We had teams of charioteers back then as well. And these teams had different colors. So you would root for the greens or the blues. They didn't have cool nicknames like eagles or tigers. So usually they spent their time fighting against each other at the hippodrome. But in 532, they were upset about harsh government laws and high taxes. And so the blues and the greens decided to work together. And what started as talk ends up becoming a rebellion called the Nika Rebellion, because the mob chanted Nika, or victory. And they were planning on overthrowing Emperor Justinian, possibly killing him in the process. And this freaks Justinian out. He's ready to abandon the throne due to fear of being killed by these rioters. He's got a ship ready to take him out of Constantinople, and his wife says, "Husband, think this over. If you run away, you're probably never going to come back as the emperor. You're giving up your crown." And she says it's better to be a strong man who's going to fight for a good cause rather than a coward. And at that point, Justinian decides he's going to stay and put this rebellion down. He and his general Belisarius come up with a plan. They're going to invite the rioters to the hippodrome and tell the rioters that they're going to listen to all of their concerns. So they're able to line up the rioters on one side of the hippodrome, and through the main gate they bring in all of the army. They lock the gate behind them, and the Byzantine army slaughter 30,000 of the rioters in the process. And this is going to save the throne for Emperor Justinian. And it's his wife who convinces him to stay. Hippodrome means horse and race course put together. And this was free entertainment for the subjects of the empire. This hippodrome could hold 60,000 fans. And as we said, the fans of different teams were named for the colors worn by their heroes, the charioteers. We have a 3D rendering of what we think it would have looked like, just like in the Circus Maximus in Rome. The hippodrome within the Byzantine Empire, the charioteers would go around in a big circle. And for me, I can't imagine watching it being too much fun except for the crashes. So now we're going to talk about Christianity within the Byzantine Empire. Christianity was supported by the government, and the Byzantine Empire wanted to unify the religion and have everyone following Christianity in the same way, as during this time there were other branches or denominations of Christianity around the Mediterranean. Most of the citizens of the Byzantine Empire were religious. We call the common people in the religion the laity, and that's going to be one of the vocab terms that you need to know. So just anybody who goes to worship would be considered laity. We also have the clergy. Those are the religious leaders like priests and bishops. And the clergy give the liturgy. The liturgy is the religious message. The church would build monasteries, and a monastery is usually a secluded community of religious people known as monks, but they're not always so secluded. And they would benefit the community. It's the church who runs the hospitals, the schools, the libraries, and orphanages within the Byzantine Empire. We are going to see the Christian church divide into two parts. We're going to have a Western church and an Eastern church, and they're divided almost along the same lines as Rome was during the time of Diocletian. The Western church would be centered in Rome, which was no longer the capital. Like the Romans, the Western church used Latin in their liturgy. They accepted the authority of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, and in this church, priests practiced celibacy, meaning they couldn't get married or have relationships with women. And the Western church will go on to become the Roman Catholic Church. We also have the Eastern church, which was centered in Constantinople, and they used Greek, or a common language, in the liturgy. They accepted the authority of a patriarch or father figure, and this father figure did not try to hold power over the emperor. In the Eastern church, priests were allowed to get married and have children. So the Eastern church would go on to become known as the Eastern Orthodox Church. So the dividing line between the East and Western church was much like the dividing line that we saw between the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire. One of the sparks to this split between the church would be over icons, or holy images. An icon was a powerful religious image, and it was thought to connect the believer to the image in the icon, whether that be one of the saints or Jesus. These icons could be painted on wood and would be decorated with gold and silver. They could also be in the form of mosaics. Now, the Pope and the Western Church, centered in Rome, supported the use of icons. But in the East, icons were going to be banned. In the Eastern Church, we have people known as iconoclasts, or image breakers. And it was Emperor Leo III of the Byzantine Empire who banned the use of icons in 730 CE. So the Byzantine Empire will not be using icons under this ban by Leo. Leo was supported by the Eastern elite, generals, and nobility. And they said that icons promote idol worship and paganism. And these iconoclasts wanted to destroy all the icons, and icons were banned in the East. All of the churches that used Latin and promoted icons were shut down within the Byzantine Empire. So we will look at some different depictions of icons, this one being a mosaic, and it's a religious image. Here we have Mother Mary with Jesus on the left. So it's an icon showing two religious figures, and you would pray to this to help connect you with Mary and Jesus. And on the right, we've got Saint Simon. And we could see icons even in the architecture, such as in this dome where we have Jesus. So things got so bad between the East and the West, the Pope in Rome excommunicated the Byzantine emperor. The Pope said that he has power over emperors, while the patriarch, the father figure who was in the East, did not claim to have this power. That's one of the reasons why the Eastern Church would keep a patriarch around and not follow the authority of the Pope from the West. Now, excommunication was the worst punishment for a Christian. If you're excommunicated, you can't take part in the sacraments. The sacraments are religious rituals that God uses to convey love. You won't need to know all the sacraments, but things like communion or baptism, which we'll talk about a little bit later once we get to the Middle Ages. So if you cannot take part in the sacraments, you will not be allowed entrance into heaven. So excommunication made you suffer in the afterlife. You couldn't go to heaven, but it could also be bad for you in your life on earth because people are going to shun you if you've been excommunicated. They don't want to be around you. It's almost like you've been polluted. In 843, icons are finally restored to the Eastern churches, but the trouble isn't over yet. In 1054, we get a permanent split between these churches. We call it the Schism of 1054. We have the Pope and the Patriarch excommunicate each other after a disagreement. And once again, those Latin churches would be shut down in the East, this time for good. What we're left with is the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East. Sometimes it's known as the Greek Orthodox Church or the Russian Orthodox Church, depending on what country or what language they're going to use. And we get the Roman Catholic Church headed by the Pope in the West. So we've got a chart, almost like a Venn diagram, to show us the similarities and differences between these two churches of Christianity. They're similar in that they're both based on the teachings of Jesus and the Bible. Both believe in baptism, and the religious leaders are bishops and priests. And both churches seek to convert people to Christianity. But they do have differences. The Roman Catholic Church has service in Latin, the language of the Roman Empire, while the Eastern Orthodox Church would have service in Greek or the local language. In the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope is the ultimate authority, and he has power over bishops, kings, and emperors. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Patriarch is more of a father figure than an absolute authority. The Patriarch does not claim to have power over the emperor, but the Patriarch just leads the church. In the Roman Catholic Church, priests are not allowed to marry, and divorce is not allowed. If you want to separate from your partner, you've got to go through a process called annulment, which means that the marriage never really took place. While in the Eastern Orthodox Church, priests could marry and divorce was allowed. We said that the reign of Justinian was considered the golden age of the Byzantine Empire, but during the latter years of Justinian's reign, bad things do happen. We end up with the first pandemic of plague. This was the bubonic plague, which was a bacteria that is transferred from rats to people through fleas. We'll spend a lot more time talking about it when we get to the Black Death, which was another wave of bubonic plague, which hit during the Middle Ages of Europe. And about a fifth of the population of Constantinople were killed off. We also see continued barbarian attacks from the West, but also the Byzantines will have to contend with the rising Muslim armies led by the Arabs, Persians, and eventually Turks. And it will be the Ottoman Turks who capture Constantinople in 1453. So that's the date we consider the end of the Byzantine Empire. One of the best ways to make sure that plague doesn't spread is to keep cats around. So here we have my cat Rampage catching a mouse. He was very proud of himself afterward. So like we said, the bubonic plague was spread from rats to humans through fleas. Here we have the siege of Constantinople, two different depictions of it. We're not very good with artwork. These look like giants who were trying to scale the walls of Constantinople. The people defending the city look just as big as the towers. And over on the right, again, not very good with artwork because here's the city of Constantinople. And it looks like these tents down here are just as big as the city. We're not good at perspective, of showing things in their actual size using depth in 3 dimensions. One new technology that the Ottoman Turks used when they attacked Constantinople would be the cannon, which is great for knocking down walls. Here we have the Ottoman army walking through the city victorious, and they would conquer and make Constantinople part of the Ottoman Empire. And it would be renamed Istanbul. This last slide will get us ready for our class next time on Russia. We have Byzantine missionaries. A missionary is someone who spreads religion. In this case, the Eastern Orthodox form of Christianity was spread, and it was spread to Russia between trade routes. We've got the Byzantine Empire, which would trade from the Black Sea all the way up to the Baltic Sea using different rivers. And along with the Eastern Orthodox religion, we also see other cultural ideas spread throughout this region, like the Cyrillic alphabet. We will see Saint Cyril adopt a Greek alphabet for the Slavic languages for the people who lived in what is today Russia. The Slavs did not have a written language, but he took their spoken language and made an alphabet for them using the Greek letters. And along with the Eastern Orthodox religion, architecture will spread to Russia as well, things like domes and arches, and we'll see that next class. But if you watch hockey and you've seen Ovechkin play, on the left we have his jersey when he's playing for the Caps. When he's playing for the Russian national team, his name looks like this, so it's using the Cyrillic alphabet. So that's going to be it for notes for today.